We were bored, reckless, and maybe a little too confident. That's the only reason we ever thought exploring that abandoned ghost town was a good idea. It was Will's suggestion. He'd heard about the place through some random YouTube urban explorer. It wasn't even on a map anymore, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, about 3 hours from the city, down a road that most people forgot existed. Supposedly, it was an old mining town that got hit by a plague in the late 1800s. After the last person died or left, the place just sat there, forgotten, overgrown. The 5 of us, me, Will, Mike, Jess, and Sophie, thought it would be fun to go see it. We were all adventure junkies in our own way, always looking for something new to break up the monotony. The idea of a real ghost town with empty buildings, maybe a creepy graveyard or two, it sounded like a weekend we'd talk about forever. The drive there was quiet. Jess joked around in the beginning, calling it the start of every horror movie ever. But as we left the main road, her laughter faded. The air changed. The trees grew thicker, darker, like they were closing in on us. No one said anything, but the mood in the car shifted. We finally reached the town just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the crumbling buildings. It was eerie. Everything was still, not a single bird or breeze to break the silence. The town itself wasn't big, just a couple of old houses, what looked like a general store, and a few other buildings that might have been used for mining. The paint had long since peeled off, and the wood was graying and brittle. Everything had that feeling of having been abandoned suddenly, like people had left in a hurry and never looked back. "Looks like a ghost's playground," Sophie muttered. She wasn't wrong. We parked on the edge of town, near what was left of a church. It was the tallest building in the area, its steeple caved in, windows shattered. We stepped out of the car and I felt it. The heaviness, the kind that makes you feel like you're intruding, even though there's no one around. "Let's split up," Mike said. "Cover more ground, see if we can find anything cool." I didn't like the idea of splitting up. It was already starting to feel like we were in over our heads. But no one wanted to be the one to back out. So we paired off, Mike with Jess, me with Sophie, and Will on his own. We agreed to meet back at the car in an hour. Sophie and I started walking towards one of the houses at the far end of town. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking with every slight gust of wind. Inside, the place was a mess, dust everywhere, furniture long since decayed, old newspapers scattered on the floor. Sophie picked one up and tried to read it, but the ink had faded almost completely. "I bet this was nice once," she said, looking around. "It feels sad." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My skin was crawling, like we weren't supposed to be here. Every step felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath. We moved upstairs even though my gut told me to stay on the first floor. The stairs creaked under our weight, but they held. The second floor was worse. 2 small bedrooms, one of which had a hole in the roof, allowing the last bit of sunlight to filter in. There was something unsettling about how empty it all was, as though the people who had lived here hadn't just died or moved, but vanished entirely. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the first floor. Sophie and I froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, holding my breath. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was downstairs. We backed up slowly, pressing ourselves against the wall, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped for a second, and then we heard a soft creak, like someone was slowly pushing open the front door. That's when Will's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie Mike insisted we bring. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Guys, I'm at the general store. Something's not right." Before we could respond, the footsteps downstairs resumed, this time faster, moving through the house. Panic gripped me. We had to get out now. "Screw it," I muttered, grabbing Sophie's hand. "Run!" We bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping on the way, and burst out of the house into the fading daylight. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel something behind us, watching, following. The air was thick with it. We met up with Jess and Mike near the car. They looked pale, their eyes darting around, scanning the shadows. "What happened to you guys?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. "We heard footsteps. Someone was in the house," Sophie gasped, still catching her breath. "We saw something too," Mike added. "A figure, in the church. We thought it was one of you at first, but it wasn't." The walkie crackled again. "Guys, I can't find the exit. It's like the road's gone." That's when it hit me. We were trapped. The same road we came in on. It was just gone, swallowed up by the forest. It didn't make sense, none of it did. We started shouting into the walkie for Will, but all we got was static. Panic set in, thick and suffocating. Mike grabbed his flashlight and took off toward the general store, and the rest of us followed. I wanted to yell at him to stop, to stay with the group, but fear made us reckless. We found Will standing in front of the general store, staring at something. His face was pale, eyes wide with shock. "What the hell happened?" Mike asked, grabbing his shoulder. Will didn't answer. He just pointed to the sign above the store. It wasn't much different from the other buildings, rotting wood, faded paint. But there was something else, something carved into the wood beneath the store's name. "They never left." We all stared at it, the weight of the words sinking in. "We need to go," Jess whispered. "We need to leave now." We didn't argue. We ran back to the car, hearts pounding, fear pushing us faster. As we drove, the road reappeared, almost as if it had been playing tricks on us. The town disappeared behind us, swallowed by the trees once again. No one spoke the entire way back. We never talked about what happened that night. None of us wanted to acknowledge the feeling that something had followed us, that maybe, just maybe, we had barely escaped. But every now and then I dream about that place. I hear the footsteps again, feel the weight of those words carved into the wood, and I wake up with the undeniable sense that something from that town still remembers us. I've been hiking alone for years. There's something about the solitude, the quiet, and the endless wilderness that pulls me in. No phone, no distractions, just me, my pack, and the trail. But last weekend, something happened that I can't shake. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. I dream about it, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I need to tell someone before I go insane. I decided to go on a solo hike in a remote part of northern Arizona. It was one of those areas no one really visits, mostly because it's so far out of the way. The trail wasn't marked on any map I had. It was just a rumor passed around on hiking forums, a hidden path that cuts through the desert and leads to nothing. I thought it would be perfect. Just me, the desert, and some peace of mind. The first day was uneventful. The desert stretched out for miles, barren and quiet. The sun was brutal, but I'd packed enough water to last me. By late afternoon, I started looking for a place to camp for the night. As I scouted around, I noticed something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or some rocks shaped weirdly. But as I got closer, I realized it was something more. Buildings. An old ghost town out here in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how I missed it on the way in. It was tucked away between some low hills, the sand blowing around its crumbling structures. I'm not talking about a couple of buildings either. This was a whole town. Saloon, church, a few houses, all of it in various states of decay. There was something eerie about it, the way it sat there untouched and forgotten. But, being the curious idiot I am, I decided to check it out. As I walked down what used to be the main street, I couldn't shake this growing sense of unease. The wind was dead. Not a single sound except my footsteps crunching on the sand. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally as they stretched across the ground. Everything was still. Too still. I stopped in front of the saloon, its doors hanging crookedly from rusted hinges. Something inside me said, "Don't go in," but I couldn't help it. I pushed the door open, and it creaked, the sound echoing unnervingly through the dead town. Inside, the floor was covered in sand, and everything was layered in a thick coat of dust, like no one had stepped foot in there for 100 years. There were tables and chairs, knocked over like people had left in a hurry. And then I saw it, a set of footprints, fresh ones. My heart started pounding in my chest. They weren't mine, and they definitely weren't old. They led deeper into the saloon, toward the bar. I followed them, my throat tightening with each step. The air was colder now, and my skin was prickling with a feeling I couldn't quite explain. As I rounded the corner, I saw what looked like an old mirror hanging behind the bar. It was cracked and filthy, but through the haze I saw a shape. It was me, but not just me. There was something else in the reflection, standing behind me, a dark, hunched figure just out of focus. I spun around, my pulse thudding in my ears, but the room was empty. The air was heavier now, thick and suffocating. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, staring at that mirror, waiting. And then I heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, like it was being forced through clenched teeth. I couldn't make out what it said, but it wasn't human. It came from the back of the room near the stairs that led to the second floor. My whole body tensed as I slowly backed away from the bar. But as I took a step, the whisper turned into a growl, long, drawn out, and unnatural, like something trying to mimic an animal, but getting it all wrong. I bolted out of there, running into the street, but the moment I stepped outside, the temperature plummeted. It was freezing, like I'd stepped into a meat locker. My breath came out in thick clouds as I stood there, staring at the town. And that's when I saw it. Every building had someone or something standing in the doorway. I couldn't see their faces, but their silhouettes were wrong, twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. They didn't move, but I knew they were watching me, waiting. And the worst part, the sun was gone. I hadn't been in that saloon more than 5 minutes, but somehow night had fallen. The sky was pitch black, no stars, no moon, just a suffocating blanket of darkness pressing down on me. I started running, not caring where, just away. But the faster I ran, the more the town seemed to stretch out in front of me, like I was trapped in some kind of sick nightmare. Every street was lined with those figures, watching, waiting. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Not until I reached the edge of the town. When I finally got out, the temperature snapped back to normal, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. But I didn't stop running until I was miles away, back on the trail, the ghost town far behind me. I collapsed by my tent, gasping for breath, my heart still hammering in my chest. It was then that I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. There, on the ground, in the dirt next to my tent, were footprints. The same ones I'd seen in the saloon, leading right up to where I'd been sitting. I packed up and left that night. Drove for hours until I hit the nearest town, shaking the entire way. I haven't gone back, and I won't. I don't care if it sounds crazy, but there's something out there in that ghost town, something waiting, watching, and I'm scared it might have followed me back. Every night since, I've heard that same guttural whisper, just before I fall asleep, and sometimes I swear I see a dark shape out of the corner of my eye, standing in the doorway. My older brother, Jake, always had this way of pulling me into his crazy schemes. He'd say something like, "Come on, man, you'll regret it if you don't." And before I knew it, I'd be knee-deep in whatever insane plan he'd cooked up. This time was no different. We were visiting our grandparents out in rural Nevada, a place where the desert seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing up everything in sight. It was boring as hell out there, miles away from the nearest town. So when Jake brought up the idea of checking out an abandoned ghost town he'd heard about from some locals, I should have known better. But being the younger brother, I didn't want to be left behind. You don't really believe in all that haunted crap, do you? Jake grinned, packing his backpack with a flashlight, some water, and his trusty pocket knife. It's just a dead town, a few old buildings. We'll be in and out in no time. I wasn't so sure. The locals had told us the place was cursed, that no one who went there stayed long. They said the town was abandoned for a reason. People just up and left, almost overnight, like they were running from something. But Jake laughed it off. Small town ghost stories, he said. We set out that afternoon, driving our grandpa's old truck down a dusty, winding road that seemed to go on forever. The sun was setting, turning the sky a deep orange, the kind of sunset that makes you feel small, like the world is much bigger than you'll ever understand. When we finally pulled up to the ghost town, it was exactly what I'd imagined. Desolate, forgotten. A handful of buildings sat in various states of decay, their wooden frames rotting and leaning like skeletons. Dust swirled through the empty streets, and the air was unnervingly still, like the whole place had been frozen in time. Jake, of course, hopped out of the truck with a grin. "Look at this place, bro. It's awesome." His excitement was infectious, but as I followed him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We started with what looked like an old saloon. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, it was a disaster. Broken tables, shattered glass, dust thick enough to choke on. But there was something about the place that made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I kept feeling like we weren't alone. "Check this out," Jake said, wandering behind the bar. He started rummaging through old bottles, laughing when he found one that hadn't been opened. "Think this stuff is still good?" "Jake, come on, let's just go," I muttered, shifting from foot to foot. "This place feels wrong." He waved me off. "Stop being such a wuss, Luke. It's just an old town." But I couldn't shake the unease. The longer we stayed, the heavier the air felt, like something was pressing down on my chest. That's when we heard it. A faint noise, like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake stood up straight, listening. We waited, holding our breath, and then the sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving outside the saloon. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though his voice was shaky now. But it wasn't the wind. The footsteps were too precise, too human. We stayed still, not daring to move, as the footsteps grew louder, circling the building. Then they stopped. Dead silence. "Maybe we should leave," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Yeah, let's go." We moved slowly toward the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. But just as we reached it, we heard a creak behind us. Something was in the saloon with us. I didn't dare turn around, but Jake's face went pale. His eyes were wide, staring over my shoulder at something I couldn't see. "Run," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the saloon, sprinting across the dusty street toward the truck. Behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps chasing after us. It wasn't just the two of us anymore. Something was coming, fast. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the door open. I was screaming at him to hurry, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The footsteps were right behind us now, so close I could feel the air shift. Finally, the door unlocked and we threw ourselves into the truck. Jake jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The truck sputtered, coughed, and died. "Come on, come on," I screamed, slamming my hand against the dashboard. Jake tried again, and this time, by some miracle, the engine roared to life. He slammed on the gas and we peeled out of there, dust flying up behind us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing. But I wasn't that lucky. There was a figure standing in the middle of the road, just where the town ended. Tall, dark, with glowing eyes that seemed to burn through the dust. It was watching us, standing perfectly still. But I knew it was the thing that had been chasing us. "Do you see that?" I gasped, pointing at the mirror. Jake glanced up, his face going pale again. "What the hell is that?" Neither of us had an answer. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on a proper road, the ghost town far behind us. Even then, we didn't talk about what we saw. Not for a long time. We never went back, and we didn't tell our grandparents what had happened. They wouldn't have believed us anyway. But every now and then, I dream about that place, those footsteps, that figure in the road. I wake up with the same sick feeling in my stomach, knowing that if Jake hadn't gotten that truck started when he did, we wouldn't have made it out. Some places are abandoned for a reason.